He said, man, that sure is some good-looking stagecoach. That's what they call a bus, a motorhome.
Shelley Winters once handed Ernest Borgnine a stack of pages nearly 20 deep, insisting they rewrite her character before another frame of film could roll. He stared at her, half in disbelief, half in dread, because he already knew this shoot was going to test him in ways no war story or gangster role ever had. Decades later, when Borgnine sat down to write his own memoir, he would still return to that name, still describe the exhaustion of working across from her, and still admit that of all the difficult people he encountered across a 70-year career, she was the one experience he never fully made peace with. By the time production began on the Poseidon Adventure in 1972, Ernest Borgnine was already a decorated veteran of Hollywood. He had an Academy Award for Marty sitting on his shelf, a run of tough guy performances behind him, and a reputation as one of the most professional, easygoing actors in the business. Colleagues from Frank Sinatra to Lee Marvin had described him as reliable, hardworking, and rarely difficult. That reputation made what happened on the set of the disaster film all the more striking, because for the first time in years, Borgnine found himself genuinely rattled by a co-star, not because of ego clashes over billing or screen time, but because of something more personal, a fundamental disagreement over how a character, and by extension a scene, should be built. Shelley Winters, cast as his on-screen wife Belle Rosen, was by then one of the most respected and most feared actresses in the business. She had already won 2 Academy Awards, for The Diary of Anne Frank and A Patch of Blue, and she had built a reputation, fair or not, as an actress who fought for control over her performances. According to Borgnine's own account in his 2008 memoir Ernie, the autobiography, Winters arrived on set having done extensive personal research into her character's backstory, and she pushed hard, scene after scene, for rewrites that she believed made Belle more believable. The original screenwriters resisted. The director, Ronald Neame, tried to mediate. And Borgnine, cast as her husband both on screen and in the emotional center of many of their shared scenes, found himself caught directly in the middle of a tug-of-war he never asked to be part of. It would have been one thing if the disagreements had stayed confined to script meetings. But the tension bled into the physical demands of the production itself, and nowhere was that clearer than during the filming of the underwater rescue sequence, one of the most technically demanding scenes in the entire film. Winters, then 51 years old, insisted on doing her own underwater swimming rather than relying on a stunt double, determined to prove she still had the strength and control to pull it off. The production team reportedly had reservations about the safety implications, but she held firm. What was expected to be a controlled, relatively short sequence stretched into an exhausting ordeal, with the scene reportedly requiring dozens of takes before the director was satisfied with the result. Borgnine, who had to remain present and emotionally engaged across take after take, later called it one of the most grueling days of his career, not because of any single dramatic confrontation, but because of the sheer accumulated strain of watching someone push themselves, and the production, to the breaking point over and over again. What makes this account worth examining seriously is that it isn't second-hand gossip pieced together from tabloid clippings. Borgnine addressed the working relationship directly in his own writing, describing Winters as talented beyond question, but also as someone who wanted to control nearly every detail of a scene, down to line readings and blocking that had already been agreed upon by the director. He used language suggesting genuine exhaustion, not performative complaint, the kind of fatigue that comes from creative conflict rather than personal animosity. In interviews given later in his life, he expanded on this, describing Winters as a force of nature, difficult, unpredictable, but undeniably gifted, a description that reads less like resentment and more like a man still working out, decades later, how he felt about the experience. And yet the word forgave carries weight here, because what lingered for Borgnine wasn't really about anger. It was about the professional toll. He had spent his career, since his earliest days scrubbing floors and chasing runaway livestock across a stage at the Barter Theater in Virginia, believing that discipline and preparation were the foundation of good work. The U.S. Navy had instilled that in him during his years aboard the USS Lamberton and later the USS Sylph, and it carried into everything from his role in From Here to Eternity to his Oscar-winning turn in Marty. Winters, by contrast, represented an entirely different philosophy of acting, one built on improvisation, personal reinterpretation, and a willingness to disrupt a set's rhythm in pursuit of emotional truth. For Borgnine, that clash of approaches was harder to reconcile than any single blow-up or shouting match would have been. There was no dramatic falling out, no headline-grabbing feud in the traditional sense. Instead, there was a quieter, more persistent frustration, the kind that comes from two professionals who respected each other's talent but never found common ground on how to reach it. It's worth noting that Winters herself, in her own later writings and interviews, rarely if ever singled out Borgnine as a difficult collaborator. If anything, most accounts from the production suggest Borgnine handled the tension with restraint, choosing to stay professional even as frustration mounted around him. That imbalance, one side processing lingering exhaustion decades later, the other seemingly moving on without much comment, is part of what makes this story different from the louder, more publicized feuds of old Hollywood. There was no ring thrown into a koi pond, no blank page left in an autobiography as a public statement, the way his brief and infamous marriage to Ethel Merman ended just a month after it began, with Merman later leaving an entire chapter about him unwritten in her own memoir. This wasn't that kind of story. It was smaller, more private, and in some ways more revealing, because it showed a side of Borgnine that his easygoing public persona rarely let audiences see, a man who could be pushed to his limits, not by cruelty, but by creative friction he never learned to fully resolve. To understand why this particular clash cut so deep, it helps to remember what Borgnine had already survived by 1972. He had grown up the son of Italian immigrants in Hamden, Connecticut, spent part of his childhood in Italy after his parents briefly separated, and enlisted in the Navy straight out of high school, eventually serving a decade across 2 enlistments that spanned the Second World War. He carried that military discipline into every set he ever walked onto, whether it was the grueling filming of From Here to Eternity, where his portrayal of Sergeant Fatso Judson was so convincing that Frank Sinatra reportedly refused to speak to him off camera for weeks, or the physically demanding shoot of The Dirty Dozen, where he insisted on performing his own stunts well into his 50s. He had weathered the volatile set of Johnny Guitar, watching the feud between Joan Crawford and Mercedes McCambridge boil over into thrown costumes and physical altercations, and he had held his own opposite the intimidating Spencer Tracy during the tense filming of Bad Day at Black Rock. Few actors of his generation had absorbed so much on-set chaos and emerged from it with his reputation for professionalism so thoroughly intact. That history makes the Poseidon Adventure experience stand out even more sharply. This wasn't a young actor overwhelmed by a difficult set. This was a seasoned Academy Award winner, a man who had already navigated some of Hollywood's most notoriously difficult personalities, admitting that one particular collaboration left him more depleted than almost anything else in his career. The exhaustion he described wasn't about surviving a single explosive moment. It was about the slow accumulation of creative friction, day after day, take after take, until even his famous patience wore thin. The Poseidon Adventure went on to become one of the defining disaster films of the 1970s, earning Winters an Academy Award nomination for her performance as Belle Rosen, a performance many critics still consider one of the most emotionally committed of her career. Borgnine, for his part, delivered a quieter, more restrained performance as her husband, one that grounded the film's emotional stakes even as chaos unfolded around them on screen. In hindsight, the tension between the two actors may have even contributed to the authenticity audiences responded to, the kind of unspoken friction that sometimes translates, almost accidentally, into believable on-screen chemistry between two people who have genuinely been through something difficult together. What lingers, though, is Borgnine's own reflection years later, when he had the distance to look back without the pressure of an active production clouding his judgment. He didn't describe Winters with bitterness. He described her the way one might describe a force too large to fully understand, someone whose talent was inseparable from her difficulty, and whose difficulty, in turn, was inseparable from what made her performances so memorable. That kind of complicated respect, admiration tangled with exhaustion, may be the closest thing to an answer as to why this particular working relationship stood out among the dozens of co-stars Borgnine worked with across his long career. In the end, what makes this story worth telling isn't scandal or spectacle. It's the picture of two enormously talented people, both shaped by very different paths into the industry, both fiercely committed to their craft, colliding in a way that neither fully anticipated. Ernest Borgnine spent his life adapting, from the deck of a Navy destroyer to the stages of a Depression-era theater paid in vegetables, from villain roles that earned him death threats to a gentle butcher that won him an Oscar. He was, by nearly every account, a man of remarkable resilience and warmth. But even resilience has its limits, and for Borgnine, those limits were tested not by a war, not by a stunt gone wrong, not even by 5 marriages that rose and fell across nearly a century of living, but by dozens of underwater takes and a stack of rewritten pages handed to him by a woman determined to leave her own mark on every scene they shared. It's a small human story buried inside a much larger career, but perhaps that's exactly why it still resonates. Even the most easygoing man in Hollywood, it turns out, carried at least one experience he never fully let go of, one that reminded audiences, and perhaps reminded him too, that even legends have their limits.